saw an article this week. Actually, Tom shared it in the group chat about Carson Beck wearing the number 11 down at Miami. Obviously, some significance there. Ken Dorsey, probably the best quarterback they've had outside of Cam Ward's 1 year. Since Miami's been, for however long, right? 25 years at this point. Now, not necessarily saying he's going to be the next Ken Dorsey or anything like that, but let's talk about Miami just in general. And I want to kind of get you guys' thoughts. I've been pretty, as a pure-on hater, I've been pretty honest about Miami and the fact that I do think that they are, are they certainly not back, but like rising up, kind of getting closer to being back than not. They've shown progress in Mario. What are your thoughts? We can go Tom first since you shared it, but what are your thoughts on just Miami in general, the state of the program, where they are this year going forward, Carson Beck, just all inclusive. This is not our Miami preview. We will do that a little bit deeper dive later on in the offseason, but just thoughts on Miami, Tom.
Yeah, it's a weird study when you look at Miami, because I would lump them in with these schools like Ole Miss, for instance, and Mizzou has done a lot of this, trying to build through the transfer portal, Texas Tech, etc. Miami's right up there with them, and like it's been known for a long time, even before this stuff was legal, that Miami was going to spend heavily on its football program. So you've seen how they've benefited from the transfer portal, but they're also this great case study of you can't necessarily build a complete team through the transfer portal. Now, they hit the jackpot with Cam Ward last year, and Cam Ward made up for a lot of things that Miami was not really great at, and he elevated that offense in a lot of ways. I wouldn't say he had the greatest weapons at his disposal. We all know about Xavier Restrepo, but outside of that, Arroyo at tight end you were excited about, and he got some more traction as the draft, is inched closer and closer. So it's not like he had an elite offense that he was working with and they made him look good. He made them look good. And then defensively, they couldn't stop anybody. They didn't have that killer instinct to finish. Mario Cristobal has been fraudulent and questionable since leaving Oregon, in my opinion. My concern with Miami is they're just going to continue to be like, let's build through the transfer portal. And that brings me to Carson Beck. I think Carson Beck is poised to have a very disappointing year. And I will point towards some statistics for you because it's my favorite thing when it comes to Carson Beck. I want to compare two stat lines for you guys so that you can have a side-by-side. These are two different quarterbacks, and I'm stealing one from Carton on Fox, but give me a shot here. 63.2 completion percentage, 4,036 yards passing, 26 touchdowns, 13 interceptions. Decent little year, right? Not too bad, okay? Let's go to quarterback number 2. 64.7% completion percentage, 3,485 yards passing, 28 passing touchdowns, 12 interceptions. Also not bad, but still, leaves something to be desired, right? Would you like to know who those two quarterbacks are?
One is Carson Beck and the other one is either Cam Ward or Garrett Nussmeier.
Quarterback number 2 is Carson Beck from last season. Quarterback number 1 is 2011 Brock Osweiler from Arizona State.
I didn't know we were getting that far.
In my opinion, Carson Beck, very similar build and athlete, all those sorts of measurables. Oh, God, he's the prototypical quarterback, all that sort of stuff. A little bit shorter than Osweiler, but still, they're the same. I am tired of everybody anointing this guy as potentially the best quarterback in football. Yes, he had a real nice year in 2023 when he was surrounded by weapons, Ladd McConkey, Brock Bowers, and a killer offensive line. And that was kind of the beginning of the gradual decline of the way that Georgia was just killing it in recruiting, as we've seen lately. Not that they haven't done badly, but obviously there's been a drop-off. I don't buy Carson Beck. And on top of that, he's coming off of a major injury to his throwing arm. Do we expect him to be good to go in week 0, week 1, week 2, week 3? Like, at what point are you getting back allegedly the return on investment for $4 million? He is having his Lamborghinis stolen left and right. He's living in Miami with his girlfriend, who is an enormous social media presence and probably a distraction in a good way. Good for you, Carson. I'm envious, really. But still, I don't see how this is supposed to work out, that you see an upgrade from the Cam Ward year at Miami to now the Carson Beck year. This feels like a guy who understands he has hype and he's cashing in at the college level. I am not against that. I want college guys to get paid and make money while they are relevant. But this will be the end of Carson Beck's relevance, and I think it's been a misstep by Miami.
So before I go to Cole, the one thing I will push back on, and it sickens me to defend Miami in any way, I do think their recruiting has been pretty good. Like I don't know that I would buy fully that they're going the Ole Miss, Florida State route of building through the portal. Their first year under Mario, they recruited number 13 overall. Their next 2 years were number 8 and number 6, according to 247. Last year, a little bit of a drop off, surprisingly, with winning 10 games, back down to 13. But I do think they've, in some areas, built really well. DB is one of those. I think they've done really well along the trenches. Both their offensive line and defensive line are really good. Now, they have some things to clean up because I don't think they've done a great job at some other positions, and they certainly haven't found that quarterback that hasn't been from the portal or from a previous regime. But I will say, I think they have built it slightly differently than even a Florida State or an Ole Miss. And their recruiting has been, I mean, it's been the best in the big three, in the state, or anyone in the state of Florida, right? So I think that they've recruited well enough to lay some of that foundation. You mentioned not having some of the weapons. One thing they did have was a very elite running game. Now, they got Martinez out of the portal from Oregon State, but the offensive line contributed to that significantly. I mean, how many times did we watch Cam Ward sit back there with 15 seconds to just kind of make a sandwich and then throw a ball downfield to Restrepo? The offensive line, they've built the right way through the high school recruiting ranks. It's taken Mario some time to build that up. And I think they've done that on the defensive line too. And we know that games are won in the trenches ultimately. And I think they're going to have offense and defensive lines, maybe again, the best kind of combo in the ACC. And so, yeah, does that stack up to Georgia's or Bama's or Ohio State's or Penn State's? Probably not. But I think for the level of competition that they'll play, they've built it the right way there. Now, again, they haven't hit it quarterback. They're really excited about the Luke Nickel kid coming in this year to maybe take over for Beck going forward after his time in Miami. But that's the one thing that I'll agree on kind of the most of it. And then again, it makes me sick to have to defend Miami. But I think they have recruited maybe slightly better than we're giving them credit for there in your diatribe.
Well, I'll push in the middle ground between both of you. Let's start out with the fact that last season, it felt like very similar to 2023 LSU. An offense good enough to win a national title, a defense that kept you out of the college football playoff. The reality is that in 2023, LSU would have gone to the playoff in a 12-team format where Miami shot itself in the foot too many times. And there were so many close calls that we had to go back to that could have easily turned in any direction. The Virginia Tech game being the big one, where if you just look and see how the ball came down, if it was called a touchdown, it should have stayed a touchdown. If it was called an incomplete pass, should have been an incomplete pass. But regardless, it felt like last year Miami kind of pushed all of its chips into the pile. We're invested in 2024. Get the veteran quarterback to build off of what we have with Shannon Dawson's style of play. Add a secondary wide receiver in Samuel Brown to pair along with Xavier Restrepo. Get a fully healthy Elijah Arroyo in the passing game as at the tight end spot. Upgrade at running back with Damian Martinez coming on in from Oregon State. They went out and they bettered their defensive line by adding in guys like Simeon Barrow and Tyler Barron, and all of them hit in terms of, yeah, they got paid, but half of them really didn't show that production. And the Carson Beck thing, I vehemently disagree with Tom on this one where we say we're anointing him. We're anointing him because if he's been able to show you that he's good enough to take you to, I think, at least an SEC championship. He did 2 years in a row. Now, the turnovers, big deal. I brought this up many a time. He has the same amount of turnovers as Garrett Nussmeier, who had 115 more pass attempts than him in the SEC. So it's a big deal, and you got to cut down on it. But also, how many of those turnovers came on drop balls by wide receivers or batted passes up in the air in Georgia? Georgia led the country in drops last season. And I'm not saying that the wide receiver core is going to be great this year down in Miami because you lost Isaiah Horton, you lost Xavier Restrepo, you lost Samuel Brown and Jacoby George, and you also lost a really good tight end in Arroyo. But you did bring in some names that I'm very excited to see. I think CJ Daniels could be a very good complementary piece. I think Alex Bauman coming on in from Tulane can be probably a good 3-down moving of the chains type of tight end. And if Beck is at least somewhat stable and they have a good ground game of Mark Fletcher, this should be a team to where at least we're saying 9 wins is possible again, 10 wins is possible again. A shot to go to Charlotte and compete for an ACC title should be on the horizon. But at this moment, Now it feels like all the pressure is in on Mario. Remember, they fired Manny Diaz for underwhelming success when he was still taking them to bowl games, and now we're looking at what Cristobal has done. Yeah, sure, you got to a 9-3 finish in the regular. I mean, a 10-2 finish in the regular season, but you lost to Iowa State in the bowl game, in the Pop-Tarts Bowl, and I get it. You talk about how players opt out. It's a big time deal, but this is Miami. There's pride there. There is expectations there. There are goals that were achievable this past season. And all we hear about is your recruiting. All we hear about is how you recruit extremely well. You bring in the right type of talents, and they do. They have a stellar offensive line that has been homegrown internally. That is such a challenge for quality teams to find these days. They've been able to, I think, establish, a good identity defensively at the linebacker position in the secondary. They aren't so codependent on the transfer portal being their only asset. But you can recruit as much as you want. If you have sour ingredients, the recipe is going to stink at the end of the day. And that's where the common ground is with Mario Cristobal. You can be a good recruiter. How does that translate onto the field? Because you shouldn't be going near overtime against a team like Cal, a 5-7 Cal team. You shouldn't be having to hope and pray that a catch comes down against Virginia Tech when they lose to Vanderbilt as a 2-score favorite in week 1 in a stadium that wasn't fully built at the time. You shouldn't be playing close against a Syracuse squad or against a Louisville squad or against any program for that matter. And frankly, that's my frustration with this Miami team. They have the talent. They've always had the talent. They don't do anything with the talent. And in a lot of ways, it reminds me of like the Dallas Cowboys. We're waiting for them to come back. We're waiting for them to come back. We're waiting for them to come back. They bring in some really fun names. And then lo and behold, we know what the expectations are. A first-round exit in the playoffs and a bunch of bitching and moaning in the offseason. That's it without the postseason picture for Mario Cristobal.
Yeah, I think the way their season unfolded, too, was such a disappointment. I will say, again, this is making me sick. I think that Miami getting to a place where 10 wins is disappointing is probably good for their program. Because 5 years ago, you just said getting 10 wins, they'd have jumped over backwards to do that, right? They did it 1 year under Rick, right? But yeah, I think that is objectively getting to. But if their season had played out differently, obviously it started so hot by going into the swamp and beating the hell out of their rivals. But then they've been bad in November and late. His first year, they were 2-2 in November. They were 1-3, or they were 1-3 his first year. They were 2-2 his next year, and they went 2-2 this year. And they've just been bad towards the end of seasons. Like they have fallen off, and that's going to be the challenge. I think what's interesting about them this year is their toughest 2 games, without question. Their toughest 2 games are out of conference. They play Notre Dame to open up, and then they play Florida in like week 3 or 4. I can't remember if they have a bye before, and then it's Florida. But they play both of them in the first month. And then outside of that, they avoid Clemson. They do play Florida State on the road. Again, I would certainly take them over Florida State right now. We'll see what they look like early in the year. They do play Louisville and SMU, which I don't think those are just give-me games. But outside of that, if you can get through that first month at 3-1, right? You split with those big 2, or somehow if you go 4-0, it's just, is there that fall off of the cliff moment? Because if not, and there's no excuse for them to not. There was really no excuse for them to not be in Charlotte last year.
There was none, just none, in my opinion.
I agree with that.
There's nobody on this schedule in the ACC that they should be losing to, right? We're high on Louisville. Maybe they can. But they still shouldn't lose that game, right? That's down in South Florida. They play Florida State early in the year again. Again, will Florida State be back? I wouldn't predict it even as being a homer. They got to go to SMU. That's not a terribly difficult place to play. I think that's a fun matchup, but you could drop one of those, right? You get to drop one of those. You don't have to play Clemson. You shouldn't drop to Florida State. So it's really like if you split with Louisville and SMU, you should be in Charlotte and playing your way into potentially an ACC championship. Now that might be against Clemson. That might be your third loss. That might keep you out. But if they don't make it to Charlotte this year, I mean, they're not firing Mario for going 9-3 or 10-2 and missing the playoffs. But you do have to question, okay, if not now, when?
The other thing that's really important, guys, is that if they lose those 2 out-of-conference games, they can only afford 1 loss to then make it to Charlotte, and then they have to win the ACC because you're not getting a 4-loss team in the playoff. I don't care if you are 7-1 in conference play. A 4-loss team is not going to the postseason, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'd agree there. So Miami's a big TBD.
I could see them losing anywhere from 2 to 5 games.
I could easily see 7
to your point about that.
Yeah,
I could see that to your point about the late season collapse. It all depends. And again, when does Carson play?
Yeah, and if they were to, which I don't think they will, right? Like even the biggest Miami hater in me right now, like I don't think they'll lose to both Notre Dame and Florida, but it's entirely plausible. Like I think both those teams are really good and have a chance to. Florida, obviously, they're in different stratospheres, but like Florida on the come up, Notre Dame continuing on. I think, and then the Beck factor. But if they were to lose both those early, does the team just mail it in, right? Like at that point, I mean, they shouldn't because again, the ACC is wide open and they should have a great chance to run the table there if they don't collapse. But if you were to drop those too early, I think the panic buttons start going off and people start getting pretty upset and how much buy-in is there after that. So thank you for watching this episode of The Power 2. This was part of a live show that you can get right now by clicking the link on the screen. We appreciate you guys for tuning in. Make sure you're subscribed to College Football Addiction so you don't miss any of The Power 2.